Hello YouTube! We are on the Real Programming channel. It is about HTML and CSS. It's a channel for beginners. My name is Andrei. I welcome. This is our 72 lesson and we'll talk about test driving with a tank of jello. Let's go. Add the two merging properties to your starbuzz.css file and then reload the page. Now, play with the size of the browsers, pretty nice. Narrow and wide. So, if we want our content in the correct order, we either have to live with an expanding sidebar or we have to use a jello layout. Is there any other way to do this? With CSS, there are typically lots of ways to approach a layout, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. Actually, we're just about to look at another common technique for creating a two-column layout that keeps the content in that correct order and avoids some of the problems of the liquid layouts. But as you'll see, there are some tradeoffs. With this new technique, we are not going to float elements at all. Instead, we are going to use a feature of CSS that allows you to precisely position elements on the page. It's called absolute positioning. You can also use absolute positioning for some nice effects beyond just multi-column layouts. And we'll look at an example of that too. To do all this, we are going to step back to the original HTML and CSS we started with in the beginning of this chapter. You can find a fresh copy of these files in the chapter 11 absolute folder. Be sure and take another look at these files so you remember what they originally looked like. Recall that we got a bunch of divs, one for the header, one for a main, one for the footer, and also a sidebar. Also remember that in the original HTML, the sidebar div is below the main content or area where we optimally like to have it. How absolute positioning works. Let's start by getting an idea of what absolute positioning does and how it works. Here is a little CSS sidebar, and to position the sidebar div with absolute positioning, don't type this in just yet. Right now we just want you to get a feel for how this works. The first thing we do is use the position property to specify that its element will be positioned absolutely. Next we set up and right properties, and we also give the div a weight. What the CSS does? Now let's look at what this CSS does. When an element is absolutely positioned, the first thing the browser does is remove it completely from the flow. The browser then places the element in the position indicated by the top and right properties. You can use bottom and left as well. In this case, this sidebar is going to be 100 pixels from the top of the page and 200 pixels from the right side of the page. We're also setting a weight on the div just like we did when it was flowed. Because sidebar is now absolutely positioned, it is removed from the flow and then positioned according to any top, left, right, and bottom properties that are specified. The sidebar is positioned 200 pixels from the right of the page and the sidebar is positioned 100 pixels from the top of the page. Because is sidebar there is of the flow, the other elements don't even know it there, then they ignore it totally. Elements that are in the flow don't even wrap their and line content around an absolutely positioned element. They are totally oblivious to it being on the page. And the sidebar is positioned 100 pixels from the top of the page. Another example of absolute position. And let's look on another example. Code. Say we have another div with the ID annoying get. We could position like this. The annoying get add is being positioned 100 pixels from the left and 150 pixels from the top. It's also a bit wider than the sidebar at 400 pixels. Now we have a second div position absolutely 100 pixels from the left and 150 pixels from the top. Notice the annoying get div is on the top of the sidebar div. Just like with the sidebar. We placed the annoying get div at a precise position on the page. Any elements underneath that are in the normal flow of the page don't have a clue about the absolutely positioned elements layered overhead. Is a little different from floating an element because elements that were in the flow adjusted their inline content to respect the boundaries of the floated element. But absolutely positioned elements have no effect what is over on the other elements. Who was on top? Another interesting thing about absolutely positioned elements is that you can layer them on top of each other. But if you got a few absolutely positioned elements at the same position in the page, how do you know the layering? In other words, who is on top? Each positioned element has a property called a z-index that specifies its placement on an imaginary z-axis. Items on the top are closely to you and have a bigger z-index. The sidebar and annoying get divs are layered on the page, with the annoying get having a greater z-index than the sidebar, so it's on the top. The header, main and footer divs are all in the flow and float on the page. There are no dumb questions. What is the position property set to be by default? The default value for positioning is static. With static positioning, the elements is placed in the normal document flow and isn't positioned by you. The browsers decides where it goes. You can use the float property to take an element out of the flow, and you can say it should float left or right, but the browser is still ultimately deciding where it goes. Compare this to the absolute value for the position property. With absolute positioning, you're telling the browser exactly where to position elements. Can I only position divs? You can absolutely position any elements block or inline. Just remember that when an element is absolutely positioned, it is removed from the normal flow on the page. So, I can position an inline element. Yes, you sure can. For instance, it's common to position the image element. You can position ems and spans and so on as well, but it isn't common to do so. Are the position property values other than static and absolute? There are actually four: static, absolute, fixed and relative. You've already heard about static and absolute. Fixed position and places an element in a location that is relative to the browser window rather than the page, so fixed elements never move. You'll see an example of fixed position in a few pages. Relative positioning takes an elements and flows it on the page just like normal, but then offset it before displaying it on the page. Relative positioning is commonly used for more advanced positioning and special effects. Do I have to specify a weight for an absolutely positioned elements just like the floated elements? No, you don't have to specify a weight for absolutely positioned elements, but if you don't, by default the block element will take up the entire weight of the browser, minus any offset you specify from the left to right. This might be exactly what you want, or it might not, so set the value of the weight property if you want to change this default behavior. Do I have to use pixels for positioning? No, another common way to position elements is using percentage. If you use a percentage, the position of your elements may appear to change as you change the weight of your browser. So, for example, if your browser is 800 pixels wide and your element's left position is set to 10%, then your element will be 80 pixels from the left of the browser window. But if your browser is just to 400 pixels wide, then the width will be reduced to 10% of 400 pixels or 40 pixels from the left of the browser window. Another common use for percentages is in specifying weights. If you don't need specific weights for your elements or margins, then you can use percentages to make both your main content area and your sidebar flexible in size. You'll see this done a lot in 2 and 3 common layouts. Do I have to know how to use z-indexes to use absolute positioning? No, z-indexes tend to be used most often for various advantages. Use the CSS, especially when web page scripting is involved. They so little beyond the scope of the book, but they are part of how absolute positioning works, so it's good to know about z-index. We'll come back to bunch on z-index again in just a bit. So, using absolute positioning. We'll talk about this in the next lesson, and that's the end of our 72 lesson. Thanks for watching, subscribe to my channel, please put likes, share with friends, comment, eat bananas, chocolate and nuts, drink more water for the effective work of our brains. Bye!